My name is Dr. Gary Danelski. Today, October 13th, 2017, my colleague Dr. Sally Wilson and I are pleased and honored to interview Dr. Donald Weinstein as part of the Ohio Psychological Association's Oral History Project. Few psychologists in Ohio or anyone else are truly skilled in entrepreneurial matters. Dr. Weinstein is clearly a remarkable exception. Through his energy, expertise, and persistence, he has created and now directs a large independent psychology practice, Weinstein and Associates Incorporated. This group practice encompasses 19 office locations throughout Ohio. His corporation employs approximately 35 people, including 25 professionals, psychologists, counselors, and social workers. Few, if any, psychologists have built larger independent practices in Ohio or anyone else. Don is clearly a pioneer at crafting a truly impressive independent psychology presence in Ohio. Dr. Weinstein has also been active in organizational psychology in Ohio. He was legislative chair of the Ohio Psychological Association from 1979 to 82 and served as president of OPA from 1983 to 84. In 1990, he was the recipient of the Ohio Psychological Association Distinguished Service Award for outstanding contributions to OPA and the profession of psychology. Don took a somewhat atypical route to becoming a practicing clinical psychologist, a route I can identify with since it's a bit similar to mine. After obtaining his BA at Franklin and Marshall College with a major in psychology, he obtained his master's degree at the University of Rhode Island in experimental psychology. He started out in academics but later moved on to clinical work. He held positions at Case Western Reserve University's Medical School Burn Unit and Comprehensive Care Unit for the Developmentally Disabled Children. He then moved out west and obtained positions in Phoenix, one with the Indian Health Service. Moving to Cleveland, Don entered the clinical psychology program at Case Western Reserve University, earning a master's in clinical psychology in 1971, and then a doctoral degree in clinical psychology in 1973. He did a clinical psychology postdoctoral internship at East Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute in Philadelphia 1973 to 74. He has remained in Ohio ever since, teaching and practicing at Lakeland Community College, Cleveland State, and Case Western Reserve University prior to establishing Weinstein and Associates Incorporated with multiple locations in multiple offices and locations that span the alphabet from Ashtabula to Zanesville and 17 other offices in between. Don, welcome to today's interview.
Thank you.
Well, we have a number of questions for you, Don. We often start with the question, tell us a bit about your early personal as well as academic life, where you were born and grew up, if you will, non-academic interests, and other things that you would like us to know.
Well, I was born and grew up in Newark, New Jersey. I am the second of two brothers. At this point in time, my brother is 6 years older and still practicing law. He is 79, which of course makes me 72, and still practicing psychology. My father was an ear, nose, and throat surgeon, having been a family practitioner for a number of years before he did his postgraduate training. My interests have always been and remain skiing. I continue to ski, much to some people's surprise. I continue to love boating in the water. My wife and I have a house in Cape Cod, and we continue to go up there, fish, boat with our grandchildren. Very early on, I was very interested in how things work, particularly how systems work, how families work. And from a very early point in life, I was interested in watching the dynamics of what was going on around me. I must say, as the younger sibling, I was very interested in watching the dynamics of my older brother and his parents, my parents. So I began an interest from very early on. I left home at the age of 14 and went to a boarding school, which was my own choice because I knew I needed to get out on my own as opposed to being under my brother's image in the communities where we lived. And I really began to thrive. And continuing with my interest in sports, I started playing soccer, and after high school went on to play semi-professional soccer for a while. The most challenging part of that was I played on a Greek team, and speaking of Greek, But as a defensive backfieldman, you know when the ball is coming and you know when to kick. I left Blair Academy and went to, as Dr. Delsky said, Franklin and Marshall College, which had a wonderful, wonderful experimental psych undergraduate program. There was one clinician there, but it was basically experimental, which I think was terrific training for what I eventually went on to do. As mentioned, I went from there in 1966 to the University of Rhode Island. At that point in time, there was a annoying thing going on called Vietnam, and it was a matter of whether I was going to be drafted out of graduate school, which was indeed happening at the time, or I had an opportunity to go into the United States Public Health Service, Division of Indian Health, where I directed the mental health programs in Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and Southern California. Now the jump and the paradox in that is my undergraduate work was an experimental psych. My graduate work was an experimental. I did rat research for a number of years, but my master's work I was doing behavioral analysis type work also. The United States government didn't care that I was a rat psychologist. They made me a clinician, put me in an area where I ran mental health programs, and I found that I preferred working with people than rats. From there, after serving in the military, I came to Case Western Reserve and basically did a joint program of experimental and clinical, because I was doing both clinical research, clinical training, and the rat research for 2 advisors. Then I went on to the postdoc that Gary mentioned in marital and family therapy, which really put it all together for me, because I was viewing things from a behavioral point of view. I had always been interested in health psychology. My father, as the surgeon I mentioned, would come home from the office and talk about 75% of his patients had behavioral problems, and they needed to see a shrink. And so it was from that I really began to develop an interest in health psychology.
Don, you first started on experimental, but later moved to clinical, and you've talked about that a little bit. You moved from the academic settings, though, in clinical to practice settings. What was behind those moves?
When I came back to Cleveland after the postdoc, I got a position at Case Medical School, what was then called Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital, or now Metro Health. And I was in both the departments of surgery and departments of pediatrics. I was successful in writing some grants for behavioral intervention with medically fragile children, but the chairman of psychiatry was limiting my salary. In 1974, I wrote a grant. My salary was $16,500. I then went on and wrote another grant through the Ohio Office of Developmental Disabilities, put my salary at $21,000. He called me into an emergency meeting to tell me that psychologists shouldn't earn that much money. These were the days when psychology was attempting to become a respected clinical professional endeavor, and we were dealing with issues of the medical establishment. It occurred to me that I could probably do better, that is to say, both emotionally and financially, if I left that environment. Lo and behold, one day I had a meeting with the chairman of pediatrics and chairman of psychiatry where they were limiting my salary, and I said, well, I have a better idea. I quit. And I went home that night, and at dinner, I had a 2.5-year-old at the time. My wife said, how's work? I said, I quit. And she said, well, are we moving to New England? I said, no, I have a 1-day-a-week practice downtown, and I'm earning as much in that 1-day-a-week practice as I'm earning on a full-time job with the medical school, so no, let's stay. And that was 40 years ago. I found that academics was too slow for me. It was much, much too political. And I think what I've come to learn very quickly is I would rather be the boss than not the boss. And so leaving the Department of Psychiatry, setting up my own business allowed me to fulfill that role.
Well, a lot of people go into private practice, but often keep it small. You went in the other direction. You built a large practice. You have different locations and rather broad in their scope. How'd that happen?
When I left the medical school and left Metro, I had spent 5 years working predominantly in pediatrics and decided that, well, I think we'll have a pediatric practice. But simultaneously, the Ohio Office of Developmental Disabilities district chairman said to me, well, take the grant with you. And so she allowed me to take the money from the state into what became a private endeavor. It provided me with rent, overhead, support staff, and I had 2 or 3 clinicians working with me, and we were consulting in what were then referred to as MRDD and now referred to as developmental disability facilities in northern Ohio. Because of the nature of Cuyahoga County, and there was no 480 bridge, people from the west side ostensibly wouldn't come over to the east side, people from the east side wouldn't go to the west side, so I decided I ought to have 2 offices. So that started out the 2-office idea. I had staff working at the facilities for the developmentally disabled. A lot of that was part-time in those facilities, and so I had 2 offices. We just got referrals and started to work in those 2 locations.
I might add that's Cleveland area.
I'm sorry, that is in fact Cleveland area. One office was in Parma on the west side, the other was in Beechwood. And then I learned of a place called Lake County, which was actually further out, Interstate 90, and I opened an office there because we had a large contract with the Lake County Board of Mental Retardation Developmental Disabilities, and I thought it was only respectable to have an office in Lake County if I was going to be charging the county for our services. So we had 3 offices for a period of time. I had 3 in support staff, and we had about 4 or 5 clinicians. One who started with me in 1974 on the developmental disabilities grant when I was at Metro, and is in fact still with me today. Rich Duvall and I have been together for our entire professional careers. So I was meeting with my accountant one day, and I said, well, this seems to be working, but how can I make more money? And she said, well, do what you're doing, but do it in more locations. And that was the seed for the idea of opening up other offices. Now, at the point in time when I had 3 offices, we were doing basically the MRDD work. I was consulting to a business in Sandusky, Ohio, that placed psychologists in nursing homes. At that point in time, the owner of the business passed away, and the nursing home directors came to me and said, would you have contracts with us? And so at that point in time, I had 27 nursing homes under contract around the state and the locations up here. Simultaneously, when I had given my presidential address to the Ohio Psychological Association, the topic was medical cost offset with psychological services. One of the attendees, a colleague of mine, Jim Schulman in Columbus, came and said, well, if you're really convinced about this stuff, let's turn it into a business. And so we did. We developed a business which carved out mental health benefits from a company that was contracted to Aetna. It required a statewide network, and then I got to go to places like Dayton, Cincinnati, Zanesville, Logan, and other places that good friends of mine who grew up in Ohio had never heard of. So the business was getting bigger. There were people all over. We had about 4 or 5 lines of service, which included the mental health carve-out, long-term care, mental retardation, developmental disabilities, the clinical work that we're doing, and then I started to meet lawyers in the workers' comp arena, and it was from them that we really expanded throughout the state, because we were doing evaluations in psychotherapy with workers' comp clients, and that's how we just kept growing and growing.
This is a follow-up on that, Don. Is it true that none of your clinicians are just practicing at one office, that they do tend to rotate? And if so, what is the rationale for that?
We do tend to rotate. I do about 28,000 miles a year in my car. Everybody rotates because there is exposure to different referral sources, different types of clients. What I have found in working throughout the state of Ohio is that the client base is different, which, as far as I'm concerned, makes it much more interesting than just seeing the same population. Nobody who works here objects to the travel, because the clinical director, Ray Ricetta, when he does recruiting and orienting, he makes it abundantly clear you will see a lot of windscreen and you will be in your car going from place to place, and it works out great for people.
Don, what are the main benefits and challenges associated with creating and directing a geographically large, dispersed psychology corporation? And if you were to start over, would you do anything differently that you learned from your experiences?
Well, I think the immediate answer is the chairman of psychiatry at Metro was wrong. I could earn more than $16,000 a year, and so I continually wanted to prove that, and apparently have proven that. I think the autonomy that having a group with people working and me being able to do what I want to do was very, very important to me. Case in point, I think it would be very difficult for a solo practitioner to be involved with OPA the way many of us have. We need the backing and the support of either an employer or a group practice where there were people putting out service while I was on my way down to Columbus to testify in front of the legislature. The other part of it was I seem to have had genetically this business acumen, which I had no training for, had no idea about, but it just seemed to develop. And because I really do like systems and I like figuring out how things work, I really did enjoy the business aspect of working with accountants, working with attorneys, working with landlords, reading leases, developing contracts with people. And really one of the most important things in doing that is I saw psychology get bigger and bigger. And I really think that we have a lot more to offer to the public than some of the other mental health disciplines, and I wanted psychology to make a name for itself and succeed.
And the challenges, looking back, what were the main challenges here?
Probably the main challenge then, the main challenge today is personnel in recruiting people and getting people. As you can imagine, most psychologists envision going to an office, staying in an office, seeing 30 people a week and being done. To the extent that that is not the model here, and when we interview and try and recruit people, we are explaining to them you will be in multiple locations. You'll be working with different populations. Clearly the clinical presenting problem might be similar regardless of whether you're in Cuyahoga County or Muskingum County, but the populations themselves are different. One of the challenges is finding people who are energetic, willing to work, and not afraid of being independent and on their own. And what I mean by that is, I have support staff in the Beechwood location. There is no support staff elsewhere. So when a clinician arrives in the Zanesville, Logan, Chillicothe office, there's a high potential that they will be working there alone, or there may be another clinician. But we are not a very socially interactive group during the day. We go to the location, we see our clients, and we go home. So that is a challenge in recruiting people, who can thrive in an atmosphere like that. Another one of the challenges is to be able to work with your referral sources, giving them what they want, while simultaneously sticking within the guidelines, rules, and ethics of psychology. As recently as Tuesday, a number of psychologists were at a meeting run by OPA and also the Industrial Commission of Ohio, in which one of the topics came up about having family members sitting in on interviews as interpreters, and that is to say a family member of the client. And the attorney from the Industrial Commission said that was fine. I didn't think it was fine. Ray Ricetta didn't think it was fine. So I quickly emailed Glenn Carr, the psychology ethics expert in the state. I asked him the question. It is not fine. And so one of the challenges is, how do you say to a referral source, in this case the state of Ohio, no, you may like it done that way, but we can't. And so it does bring out whatever diplomacy a guy from Newark, New Jersey has, which isn't much, but working with the referral sources, seeing them as the client, satisfying them, but sticking within the boundaries of the ethics and the clinical guidelines that we have is really quite a challenge.
And the final part of that question, if you were to start over now, would you do anything differently? It clearly evolved, but looking back, would you do anything differently based on your experiences?
So there are two or three ways to answer that. One of which is, I would actually take an accounting course. I feel sorry for my accountant, who's been my accountant for 40 years. It's every year they have to explain to me what depreciation is, why they're still depreciating a car I don't drive, why they're depreciating this sofa I'm sitting on. So we go through that year in and year out. I think being able to read a spreadsheet, reading a profit and loss sheet would probably make it much more enjoyable to me. So that's number one. I am of the age where I don't know computers very well. I don't know Excel. I probably should. I would learn those as background things. There is no question that I would do the exact same thing as far as multiple locations, multiple disciplines. I would like to have hired a psychiatrist or advanced nurse practitioner to have somebody in-house. I was never comfortable with that until about 2 or 3 years ago. I'm not an advocate of psychologists having prescription privileges, so I would not have gone in that direction. I think that doing what I have done and enjoying it as much as I have, being able to have taken off minimally 3 weeks of vacation after being in practice about 5 years, and now about 20 weeks of vacation a year, I can't imagine a better way to spend my time.
Well, you were quite active in the Ohio Psychological Association, as was I, by the way, a solo practitioner who was ethics chair, etc. But at any rate, you served as the OPA legislative chair and then president. Why did you get involved, and where did it lead you?
Well, those are two terrific questions, and there's a simple answer to why I got involved, and that is because Henry Saman called me and said, "You will get involved." And what he said was, it is your turn to give to your profession, which really rang true. I think that the whole idea, and again, remember, this was back in the 70s when psychology was really in its nascent stage as an independent profession. The absolute benefit from a very selfish point of view is the people I met, who were wonderful people, the things that I learned from them, and then the opportunities by being on the forefront of psychology in Ohio, where Ohio was really on the forefront of psychology in the nation. I was then able to capitalize. For example, I recently had a deposition in the office a year ago, and the attorney for the defense, I was working for the plaintiff, the attorney for the defense was in his past one of the commissioners for the Industrial Commission of Ohio. When we finished the deposition, I said to him, "Mr. J, you are the reason we are here today. When you were one of the commissioners, I testified in front of you on behalf of the Ohio Psychological Association for why the Industrial Commission and the Bureau of Workers' Compensation should use psychologists. And it was your decision with the two other members on the commission that allowed us to do Industrial Commission workers' compensation work. And when I left the testimony and I was walking back to the OPA offices with Henry, I said to him, gee, what a great opportunity. Maybe I'll start doing that kind of work. That now is about 90% of our gross fee income in the office. So I was doing it for everybody, but saw it as opportunities. Another example of that is the whole idea of what Jim Schulman had presented that we turned into behavior care, and that was the idea of managed care was starting out in healthcare. Managed care was slow to come to mental health. I knew it was coming, and I thought we ought to be in charge of it instead of some insurance company. And so we created that business. I was able to staff that business around the state because of my involvement with OPA. I met psychologists from everywhere around the state. I had a lot of respect for my colleagues. I was able to call them up and say, I have this opportunity, would you be interested? And so that business was off and running. The same was true of the nursing home business. I knew people from around the state from OPA, so I really was able to monopolize on it and use it as opportunities for myself. The other thing that one cannot forget is that we need a strong professional advocacy group locally, not just APA, but locally. And after I was done being president of OPA, I went around the country doing consulting to other state psychological associations and other practices. And I was very adamant about you need to get behind your state association because that's who will advocate for you and that's who you will learn from.
There was a follow-up question to that, Don. In what direction do you feel psychology needs to move, or perhaps move more rapidly than it's doing now?
Well, I think that there's sort of two ways to look at that, one of which is on a national scale. We have a dilemma with healthcare, which is truly in crisis right now. And I'm not necessarily making a political statement, but more of a very practical statement. If 4 of the top 10 killers in our country are behavioral killers, we need to get on top of that as behaviorists. We are the behavioral interventionists. We are the health behaviorists. And I think that we run the risk of being left out of that. I'll take you back to 1974 when I went to the medical school, and it was in the medical model. Although we have moved away from that, we are now talking about integrated health care where psychologists or mental health professionals are joining healthcare practices and are going in as, whether they're paraprofessionals or other types of professionals in these offices. I think psychology as a profession on a national level needs to start spreading its wings and getting much more involved in epidemiology and public health, both from the educational point of view, for example, smoking cessation, and other behavioral problems that have gone on that have caused things like obesity, diabetes, heart problems, cancer to be the big killers. I think we need to really progress in that area.
Moving forward and perhaps related, John, what advice would you give young people who are considering a career in professional psychology?
Well, I think that I am still of the background and ilk based on the philosophy of tikkun olam, to go out and cure the world and take care of people. I think there's absolutely nothing more admirable and honorable than helping people, and I think that psychology is an absolutely wonderful way to do it. I think it is important to like people and like being with them to be a psychologist. I think the professional schools, the PsyD programs, in addition to the PhD programs, are wonderful training backgrounds. I think that the whole idea of being able to intervene and help, whether it's an individual, whether it's a family, whether it's an organization, is just a wonderful way to spend your professional life. I remember when I was trying to make the decision about leaving the medical school and going into independent practice, I met with a senior clinician who was in independent practice in Beechwood, and one of the things he said to me rings true to this very day. He said, you will spend your day with nice people, and you will spend your day enjoying what you're doing. And it's absolutely true. As we hire new psychologists in the practice, I find that these are young people who are interested in spending time with people, interested in helping people, and by self-selection, they've gotten themselves into just an absolutely wonderful profession.
Very good. Now, you certainly had a very diverse and interesting career. Looking back on your career overall, what are you most proud of?
In reality, I think one of the things I'm most proud of is that I employ 34 people in a very successful way. They seem to enjoy their jobs. As I mentioned, Rich Duvall's been with me since 1974. My clinical director has been with me since 1984. One of the other staff clinicians has been here since 1980. People come and they seem to like working here. To me, that is a wonderful endorsement of the atmosphere, the product, and what we have going for us here. The other thing is, I really do think we've helped people. And when I look at the people that we have helped rehab, the people we have helped either adjust to their disabilities, overcome their disabilities, that's been very gratifying. I also think that we have done something that, as you pointed out in the introduction, really hasn't been done before. As an individual who knows very little about business and knows much less about marketing, I've been able to do this, and that's really been fun. I have said to my wife that if I knew how to play golf, I might be successful in business. I don't play golf, but it seems to have happened anyhow.
Well, we have a free-form question that we frequently end with. You get to say anything else you want to say. So what would you like to add here?
I think it's absolutely mandatory that you give back to your profession. I think that we can't know everything, and we can't know what's going on in the legislative arena nationally, locally, but it does impact us. We cannot be isolated in our practices, solo or otherwise. We need people to be advocates for the profession and be interested in sharing that information. None of the work that we did at OPA and none of the stuff that we do here at Weinstein Associates is secret. The more successful more psychologists are, the more successful the profession would be. And I think being an advocate for your profession is really very important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's been a pleasure interviewing you, and I must say you certainly have had some varied and very successful experiences, and I hope that the young psychologists looking at this, or psychologists to be, can learn a great deal from it. I think they will. Thank you very much, Don.
Thank you both.